It is not only important that we measure the web performance of the website with respect to network optimization and page load times, but also it is very important that we measure the performance, or indeed the performance of the website is good even after the initial page load. Remember the rail model that we have already discussed in the previous session, in which R stands for the response, which corresponds to the visual feedback once we are in the site after the page load. So let us talk about these aspects in this session. So web performance, user experience, which corresponds to the experience time or the feedback time after the page load, when the user is actually interacting with the website. So this typically corresponds to the R in the rail model, which stands for response. And as we have already discussed in the previous section, a typical performance goal that would be set for R is typically 100 milliseconds. So if the instant feedback, or if you don't get an instant visual feedback within 100 milliseconds, users typically feel that the website is not performing well, or the website is kind of a little bit slow. Alright, now in order to achieve this goal, instant feedback in 100 milliseconds during the interaction with the site, may it be a click or a tap or some kind of scrolling, whatever, we can do certain things. First is, we can optimize the websites for mobile browsers. So if the mobile browsers are displaying websites that are not optimized for them, typically studies say that the instant feedback is around 300 milliseconds. Now this is basically because when you open up a web page that is not optimized for mobile in a mobile device, and look for any particular kind of links, say for example, and if you try to click that link, typically you double click or double tap that particular link in order to navigate to that particular site or navigate to that particular link. Now this causes what is called as a zoom in delay. Now this zoom in delay causes the additional 200 milliseconds of delay. Alright, so the reason is because of the double tap to zoom into the link. That happens because the website has not been optimized for the mobile. Now, the solution would be to make the website mobile friendly or responsive in nature. Now, one way to do that would be to have a mobile viewport using this approach on the website. So we can have meta name equal to viewport, which will actually create a mobile viewport so that you don't get a zoom in delay, and probably your website is optimized for mobile viewing so that you don't get this extra delay, extra 200 milliseconds of delay. Alright, now alternatively we can also make use of a selector called as touch action manipulation. Now this selector could be either applied to the entire body or to a particular element or according to the requirements, which will also disable the double tap to zoom in. Alright. Now the third approach is to free the main thread at the earliest. That is because A website makes use of a single user interface thread to do all its parsing, its rendering, and the execution of the JavaScript. Alright, when everything happens on the same thread, we need to typically ensure that we release its main thread or this single thread as soon as possible. Most importantly, when we have event handlers. For example, say within a website or a web application, you have a checkbox or a button, and you handle that button through on click, and if the user does not actually feels the press of the button, he feels uncomfortable because he expects that when the button is clicked, he should be able to see a instant feedback of the button press. And if he doesn't get that immediately, he gets frustrated or feels that the website is not up to the mark. Alright, so it is very important that if event handlers are being executed through JavaScript, the main thread is released immediately. That is because when the execution happens, the main thread is blocked up or it is used up and the rendering doesn't occur. Alright, so we need to release the main thread as early as possible. And say for example, you have some processing which takes more time. In that case, how do you actually ensure that the main thread is released at the earliest? For that, we can make use of some tricks and solutions by using asynchronous functions like setTimeout and passing in the callback as the argument and another argument which is 0. Now calling setTimeout with callback and another argument 0 actually ensures that the function is kind of immediately executed, but it is not unlike normal functions in the sense this callback function when called through some setTimeout actually goes to a particular table and the function is actually called when the browser is idle immediately. Alright, so in the timer queue, the function is called in the next loop when the browser is idle. Similarly, we can also make use of a function which is much more advanced or modern, which is setImmediate. So you can make use of functions like setTimeout and setImmediate to execute functions that take some more time when the browser is idle. Alternatively, you can also make use of web workers. Now, when you make use of a web worker, you typically achieve concurrency by making use of a separate thread. So that way your main thread is not interrupted or blocked so that your parsing and rendering can be done. And at the background, you can make use of a separate web worker or a separate thread which can do the heavy lifting. Alright. So the idea is illustrated through this diagram taken from this URL. So you have the main thread. So from the main thread you create a worker thread which creates a separate thread which actually can run in the background or independent of the main thread, and the web worker can do its own heavy lifting, and finally when the heavy lifting is done it can send the message back to the main thread so that the rendering and parsing is not affected in the main thread. Alright guys, so that was web performance with respect to the user experience. after the initial payload, so that the users, even after the page has been loaded fast, they actually feel that the website is indeed fast or the performance of the website is good after they have the satisfaction of the instant visual feedback within 100 milliseconds. Alright guys, so thank you.